Well, I hate that so bad, Sandra. I hate to be the one to make you mess up, or I have to find a different way to put that, won't I? Can you do a master's? Well, I can just be a hard grader on the last one, I guess. That's what I had to be. All right, Acts chapter 24. Well, we're coming to the end of this book. After tonight, we just have 2 more classes, don't we? All right, chapter 24. We find Paul last time in Caesarea. He was, tried to kill him. They pushed him out of the temple, slammed the door shut. They wanted to kill him, and attempted to make a plan where they would murder him going from the castle in Jerusalem over to where the council met, and the chief captain was told about the plan, so they rushed him off to Caesarea, and he met Felix. Right, Felix is I get those fellows mixed up. Felix and Felix, and then they rush him out over there, and that brings us up to chapter 24. Let's read the first 9 verses. And after 5 days, Ananias, as the high priest, descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so." So what we have here, we've got these enemies of Paul. Of course, as we mentioned, he was drug off to Caesarea. They had attempted this mob action. They had attempted to assassinate him, and they conspired against him. All of these attempts had failed. And now they go find this man Tertullus. They drug an orator out of the bag of tricks they had, and so they're going to go this route. And so 5 days after having been taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea, Ananias, the high priest, the elders, Tertullus, they went to accuse Paul before Felix. Now, it's important to understand the time frame here, because Paul is going to use this in explaining and standing up and defending himself. Paul had been in Jerusalem for about 5 days, chapter 21, or 7 days rather. The trial was 12 days after his having arrived in Jerusalem, chapter 24. Now that's where we get the 5 days. Okay, we'll expound on that a little bit more. Now the high priest and the elders, they had made this trip because they wanted to show the governor here how important this was and how dangerous Paul was. Paul was so dangerous to society, he had to have something done to him. In fact, what was it they wanted to have had done to him? They wanted him to be killed. He needed capital punishment. This is how bad he was. And so they set forth the formal charges against Paul, however baseless they were, But it's pointed out, and we're going to notice as we continue, he couldn't prove any of them. Now, Brother Bowles noted in his commentary, and I forgot to put, I noticed just now, the page in his commentary, but anyway, Tertullus was a Roman lawyer, and what they would do, they would often go out into the provinces to gain practice. And so he's noted as an orator, but obviously he was also a lawyer. And often when we look at this term lawyer, and we're reading it in the New Testament, it's lawyer in the sense of the law of Moses. Well, this man was a lawyer in the sense of the Roman law, okay, as well. And that's why he was standing in this court, because this isn't a Jewish court. This is a Roman court in which he is standing before the Roman governor. And so he is practicing Roman law. And so he wanted to gain, they would often go out in the provinces to gain practice of the law. And now in verse 6, we learn something also about Tertullus. He spoke of himself as a Jew because he referred to our law. They would have handled Paul according to our law, the Jewish law, if Lysias hadn't come in and interfered and really saved his life, is what he did. And so Tertullus was also a Jew. Now, when Tertullus was called forth to accuse Paul, notice what he did. He started off with flattery. He started bragging on Felix. Oh, Felix. I can just hear him. He's just dripping with sweetness. It is so quiet around here. Through your providence. And in fact, this is the only place in the Bible where we read that word providence. It's not connected with God at all. But we do learn from this word what providence means. Okay? It's not used improperly at all. But he begins to compliment him, and he credits Felix with the current situation and the quietness and the safety that had been going on, and it's not undeserved. Felix had done a very good job in handling the spate of robberies that had been happening, the group of hordes of organized bands of assassins and things. And now, if you recall, when Paul was first taken captive or arrested, who did they think he might have been? That Egyptian who was an insurrectionist. Huh? No, this is during his time. There was an Egyptian that was during this time frame. I can't recall his name. I didn't put it in the notes. But he had caused an insurrection in claiming to be the Christ. And Felix had his administration had put that insurrection down during that time frame. And so Felix had done a really good job in calming the area. The citizens had enjoyed quietness. They could live without being worried about these robbers and these assassins and people interrupting their lives. But what he did not mention was the fact that Felix was behind the assassination of Jonathan, another high priest. That's a historical fact. So Felix wasn't all great. He was your classic Roman under ruler. And I've got some information in here about Felix. We won't cover that, but I've put it in there. Josephus mentions him in Antiquities. But anyway, he continued his flattery by saying that, well, I don't want to continue on and be tedious, but just listen to me for a few more minutes as I brag on you. So he might listen to those few words. But anyway, here are the 4 accusations that were plainly stated. They didn't have a problem plainly stating these accusations, but they couldn't prove, they had no basis for them. They accused Paul of being a pestilent fellow. Well, that means to create trouble, to be injurious to peace, to stir up strife. You're breaking the public peace if you are a pestilent fellow. Now, Was Paul once a pestilent fellow? Well, he was as far as the church was concerned, wasn't he? He certainly was a pestilent fellow. But he, at this time, was causing problems for the Jews, but not in the sense of disturbing public peace. He was just simply pointing out their false beliefs and their sins. But he was doing things for the good of all and to the harm of none. So he wasn't a pestilent fellow. He was charged with being an insurrectionist. Now, by this charge, they were hoping to gain Felix's anger and wrath toward Paul, because the Romans were very quick to squash anyone who was accused of being an insurrectionist. They would not tolerate that. They were going to come down hard on that. But when we study the gospel does not ever encourage Christians to be insurrectionists. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Romans 13, 1 through 5, really should be 1 through 7. We are to be in subjection to our civil leaders, and we are to pray for them, 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 2. The gospel leads its believers to rise against sin, not against our leaders, not against our civil leaders. We're to follow our civil leaders unless what? Goes against God's law. Now, we're not ever going to follow them when they go against God's law. And so Paul and the other faithful, they impacted the world by exposing idolatry through the preaching of the gospel. He was also accused of being a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, that was not intended to be a compliment by Tertullus. He wasn't trying to compliment Paul. He was belittling Paul. He was ridiculing Paul. And, we have similar statements leveled against Christians in modern time as well. It hasn't been that long ago. I haven't heard it in several years, but Christians used to be called Campbellites pretty regularly. I remember, though, I was probably 13 years old before I was ever called a Campbellite. I didn't even know what it meant. I said, "What are you talking about?" A Campbellite. Never heard of anybody named Campbell. What is that? And I had never studied church history or anything. And we're not Campbellites. I think we owe a debt of gratitude to all of the Restoration people, but we're not followers of those people at all. But by calling Paul a ringleader, Tertullus was accusing him of being a prominent member of that despised sect. But here's the thing. Paul, he freely admitted to being a worshiper of God, of the God of his fathers, who was the same God that these sinful Jews recognized as the God of heaven. Now, they weren't worshiping him properly, and they were absolutely sinful, but Paul had every right to worship God and to be a Christian, because he had not established his own religion. It was within the Roman law for him to worship God in that way, so they didn't have anything there to accuse him of. That was not breaking the law. Then he was accused of attempting to profane the Jewish temple. Now, let's just say, for instance, if he had have profaned the Jewish temple, that didn't have anything to do with the Roman law. They didn't care about that. Well, they especially violated it in AD 70 when they went in there and destroyed it. So, yeah, they didn't. I mean, that temple had been profaned multiple times. But, that didn't have anything to do with Roman law. And Tertullus realized that, and that's why he quickly added to that statement, and we were going to handle it according to our law. But then Lysias came in and interfered. And notice what he said. He came in and took Paul with great violence. Well, first of all, he didn't take him with great violence, but notice what he left out. He left out that Jewish mob that was trying to kill Paul and murder him, and they were instituting great violence. So everybody's leaving out, a lot of information here that would be relevant. And so, that was a serious charge to the Jews. But there was no evidence that Paul ever intended to do that. Paul didn't, we talked about Paul going in during that to do the purification ritual. And however you feel about how Paul did that or why he did it or what the result of that was, really is beside the point as far as these charges go. But here's the thing. Paul went in there and he performed a ritual of purification. He wasn't profaning anything. When they went in there, they found him purified. He wasn't profaning the temple. He didn't take in the Greeks into the temple. He did not do that, for sure. And so he had not profaned the temple. And the very reason he did that was to gain favor of the Jews. Remember, he was going to go in there. He agreed to go in and do the ritual to gain favor of the Jews. Again, our discussion now isn't about whether he should have done it or not. The whole purpose in his mind was for it to be an expediency to gain favor of the Jews. Now, if he thought he was profaning the temple, or if he was profaning the temple, that would have gone against exactly his whole aim, wouldn't it? His whole purpose would have been defeated. So he wasn't profaning the temple, so we can be sure he was innocent of that charge. Well, we know he was innocent of all of them, but certainly he was innocent of that one. Now, Tertullus continued his speech by saying, the Jews had apprehended Paul and they intended to judge him according to their law, but the chief captain disrupted their plans. Now, again, they were in the process of trying to murder Paul. That's what they were trying to do. They did not intend legal action. And if Lysias had not intervened, Paul would have been dead in a few moments. He would have been murdered. And so anyway, he concluded his speech by stating that Lysias, the chief captain over the Roman garrison at Jerusalem, had commanded Paul's accusers to make this long journey and make their case before Felix. And he added to Felix that you can verify all of this by simply examining the chief captain. And then all those who had accompanied Tertullus, all those Jews who were standing with him, agreed with their spokesman. And then comes time for Paul to speak. They laid out their plan. They laid out their charges. And in their mind, they think, boy, we've got him now. This is watertight. We can nail him. There's no way that he can answer any of these charges. So, Felix motions to Paul. This is the passage of verses 10 through 21. So he motions to Paul so Paul can speak. Well, Paul first called attention to Felix as well. And he mentioned that Felix had been a governor for quite a while. And that he stated that he was happy and that he was glad to reply to these charges that had been lodged against him. He addressed each charge, and he showed that they had no foundation in any truth. Now notice what he had mentioned. He begins with this idea of being an insurrectionist. He said that he had entered Jerusalem only 12 days ago. Now remember, he's standing in Caesarea right now, and he says, from this point, I entered Jerusalem 12 days ago. He said, in 5 of those days from today have been spent traveling to Caesarea under guard to hear. So out of those 12 days, 5 of those, I've been under guard here. He had been in Jerusalem for only 7 days, he says. Okay? Now, out of those 7 days, one of those days was in custody in the castle. So now it leaves you how many days? That leaves you 6 days, doesn't it? So his point is this. How can anyone be an insurrectionist and stir up trouble and cause a war against Rome in 6 days? That's the point he's making. I didn't have enough time, so I'm not doing that. So he denied they had any foundation also that he was in the temple disputing with anyone or trying to stir up the people. He hadn't done any of those things in the synagogue or in the city. So he categorically denied their accusations. Then he declared his enemies could prove none of the charges they had alleged against him. And who is the burden of proof supposed to be on anyway? The one laying the charge. We're not supposed to have to prove our innocence. That's kind of always been a universal thought, right? He admitted that he worshiped the God of his fathers. Again, he's allowed to do that. He also added that he believed all things recorded in the law and the prophets, and that being a Christian, he could see how the Old Testament was fulfilled in and then replaced by the New Testament. Now, let's keep in mind that though the New Testament was not completed until I believe, toward the end of the first century, I believe the late date for the Revelation, at any rate, but the New Testament was always completed within the apostles themselves. They always had the completed Word of God. His entry into the temple for the purpose stated in Acts 21 did give his enemies the opportunity or the occasion to accuse him of something, but it gave Paul a strong defense against the accusation of his profaning the temple. Now again, here he mentions his belief in the resurrection, including the just and the unjust being resurrected, it being a singular event. He mentions all of that. The resurrection affecting all of the dead, regardless of your spiritual condition. And that's very important that this is mentioned again. And this really bolsters these doctrines that we read about in the New Testament, because we find different places where this is evidenced and supported. Okay? We can go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and read about the resurrection, but we've read about it now a couple of different times when Paul is defending himself before the council. Now he's defending himself before Felix, and he's speaking about this resurrection, because the first time we mentioned, he so smartly saw an opportunity to divide the Pharisees and the Sadducees on this subject of the resurrection and angels and spirits. And now he's retelling it, so we have recorded for us through inspiration these truths regarding this resurrection. And there's so many people in the denominational world that deny these truths, and we have different locations in the New Testament where these truths are repeated. So, who should someone believe? These repeated facts in different places, or someone all of a sudden decides, well, there's going to be several resurrections separated by 1,000 years, or there's only going to be this resurrection, or only the righteous will be resurrected, the unfaithful will never be resurrected. So there are different beliefs concerning those things. So once again, we see Paul confirming his sincerity in the practice of his religion, his desire to always live where he would never offend God and never offend his fellow man. He never wanted to unnecessarily offend his fellow man, and that in itself is a lesson that we all ought to take to heart. When we study with people, we need to always present, and he told the Ephesian brethren, you teach the truth in love. If the gospel offends someone, we can't help that. The gospel truth will offend most people. But if the person presenting the gospel is unnecessarily offensive in the way they present it, well, we need to reevaluate our technique of presenting the gospel, because now we've lost the opportunity to bring others to Christ. Now, He continues on. He talks about after many years of traveling through the Gentile lands, he stated that he had returned to Jerusalem. And one of the reasons he had returned to Jerusalem, you recall, was he wanted to bring this gift of alms and money for the poor and the needy in Jerusalem. And if they needed to confirm that, the only thing they need to do would be to contact Jerusalem, talk to James and the elders there. That wouldn't be a problem. They could say, okay, yes, that's exactly what happened. Everyone would have known that. Now he's showing now that he's not trying to cause a problem. He's not trying to hurt his fellow Jew. You have these Jews saying, well, we want to judge him according to our laws. He's doing this, this, and this. When all anyone looking from the outside would have to say is, oh, wait a minute. This man has traveled all through these Gentile lands, and we have proof of it. He's gathered up this money for you poor, needy people, and he brought it himself. And you're accusing him of all this? This doesn't hold water. This doesn't hold water at all. And so he's laying this out. And so they can see that his aim would never have been a selfish aim. Then he speaks about these certain Jews from Asia who had found him in the temple after he had been purified according to the old law. And then he points this out. He says, they didn't find me among a multitude of people trying to stir up a problem. They didn't find me right in the middle of a problem, in the middle of chaos or anything like that. And he said, for this to be a proper court, they should be here. If we're going to have a judicial hearing, they ought to be here if they had a problem with me being in the temple. And if they're not here, these people need to say whether or not I've done something wrong. They haven't been able to do it. They should have done it back there in Jerusalem. They didn't do it then. They couldn't bring a charge that stuck then. They're not doing it now. And so, with that concluding remark, Paul let Felix know the real cause of the charge against him was sectarian hatred for him. That was the real reason. They just simply hated the man. They wanted him to die. And then he mentioned that by just crying out, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called and questioned by you this day. And that's what broke up the council meeting, wasn't it? We recall that. That just tore everybody up. And it is thought, I didn't put this in the notes, but it is thought that the high priest at that time, at that council meeting, was a Sadducee. And so that would have automatically put him at odds with Paul. So he's hating Paul automatically. And we're going to notice, and that kind of makes sense after I read that. Of course, that's just a secular, what's the word I'm looking for? Tradition. So we don't have that in the Bible. But that makes sense that might be correct, because we're going to notice that in verses 22 through 27, Paul is delayed for 2 years, right? That's the idea. But we're going to find out, does their hatred for him lessen over the 2-year period? No, it doesn't. So that would make sense to me. Any comments or questions? Well, let's notice this final passage here. For Felix heard the case up to that point, so he makes a decision here. He wants to hear from Lysias, the chief captain. And he wants him to hear from him when he has opportunity to come to Caesarea and give his testimony. Well, in the meantime, Paul was going to be kept in custody. Now, he's going to be allowed a certain amount of freedom. He can receive friends, and he's going to be able to preach the gospel and teach, and he's going to be able to have people come and go. And that is a penalty. That would penalize Paul. But that is not going to give his enemies the full satisfaction they want, because they want Paul dead. They want that man to be killed. In their minds, he doesn't deserve to be alive in this world. Can you imagine a hatred for someone that steep that you not only want them dead, but you want them to be tortured and harmed in every way possible before they're dead? So anyway, a period of time goes by. We're not told how long. And Felix and his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewish woman, sent for Paul. And they wanted to hear what he had to say concerning his faith in Christ. They wanted to hear a little bit about the gospel. Now, Drusilla we're told she's a Jewish woman, but she's going to have a connection to the next chapter, to a man who is the King Agrippa. Agrippa's going to show up here in a few minutes. We're going to get to it. And he's going to bring his sister with him, Bernice. Bernice and Agrippa and Drusilla are all siblings. They're a brother and two sisters. Now, Agrippa and Bernice, they got an odd relationship. They got something going on there. But anyway, they wanted to hear about this Christ and Paul's faith. And so Paul preached to them, and he presented this the gospel to them. And so he had this opportunity. Do you think Paul kind of sugarcoated it a little bit and held back some? No, Paul preached the gospel, and he preached it to them just exactly the way it ought to be preached and taught to anyone. So it says that he reasoned with Philip. Now that's the usual way of preaching and teaching among these inspired men we hear about. And it ought to be the way preaching and teaching is taught everywhere. That means that they didn't use oratory gimmicks. They weren't Tertullus. Okay, they weren't like him. They simply taught a straightforward presentation of the gospel. That doesn't mean people shouldn't try to get better in their speaking abilities. We ought to always try to improve ourselves, try to use proper speech when we can learn how to speak better. Do that. I tell people, times I've gone out of the country, I've been asked if, I speak different languages. If I have a second language, I said, well, English is my second language. I haven't quite mastered it yet. And, but, what we learn from this isn't that we do not need to try to better our abilities. But what we're learning here is Paul didn't speak in the way of the Greeks in Athens. He didn't use gimmicks and oratory gymnastics to try to get a message across. He used the straightforward, true gospel. And he reasoned with Felix and Drusilla, and he reasoned of righteousness. Well, that's doing right. That's what righteousness is, doing right, obeying God. Righteousness is revealed in the gospel. That's where we learn about it. That includes preaching the facts, the commands, the warnings, the promises of the gospel, and urging people to be obedient to it. He reasoned with Felix of temperance. That's self-control. We are required to be moderate, in things that are right, even in things that are good. We are to be moderate, okay? And we are to totally abstain from evil things, okay? So we are to practice moderation. He reasoned with Felix of the judgment to come, Hebrews 9:27. Now, many people in the religious world have completely ignored and have chosen to ignore the coming judgment. But it can't be ignored. Now, what was the result of this? We don't know how long that Paul taught. I imagine that it depended on how long Felix and Drusilla were willing to listen. But what we do know is the response that it elicited from Felix. And what happened was it terrified him. It terrified Felix, and it should have terrified him. He needed to be terrified. James talked about snatching the soul from the fires of hell through fear. You do that to some people. That is the way some people gain their salvation, through fear. It's okay to be afraid of going to hell. Now, that's not the only reason that one obeys the gospel, but is that one of the reasons that one would want to obey the gospel? Well, sure it is. No one wants to go to hell. We read about the rich man. If that doesn't want to encourage you to be obedient to God, something's wrong with you. Right? No one wants to be in torments, let alone be in hell. It has to be worse. I don't know how it could be, but it must be. So it terrified him, but it did not change him. And here why would something that is so terrifying not change a person? It affected him on an emotional level. The gospel is not an emotional religion. It is a reasonable religion. That's why Paul reasoned with him. People can become emotional. That's what happens. You see it in the denominational world, and you read the history, particularly if you were to study church history, and you learn about these folks that decided to search and study their way out of denominationalism, or you talk to someone of a modern time who studied their way out of denominationalism or had help coming out of denominationalism, and they can tell you about personal experiences of maybe being in a denomination, and they tell you about the mourner's bench, or they tell you about this, and they get all emotional because they get scared up, and then they'll go forward and they'll pray and pray and pray, and then tomorrow, when the sun comes up, everything is calmed down. They're right back where they were before. The fear is all gone. The gospel, the New Testament church, is not emotional. It is there emotion in Christ's church? Sure there is. Sure there is, but it's not emotionalism. And so there's a difference there. And so Felix allowed himself to be emotional and to be terrified, but tomorrow morning when he woke up, see, he allowed himself to push that all out of the way and not to think about it. He ignored it. And so that was the problem. So he delayed his obedience to some future convenient time that, as far as we know, never came. Because Paul said, today is the day of salvation. Now is the day, 2 Corinthians 6, verse 2. Now, this crook Felix, what was his real desire to get from Paul? Money. Wanted some money. He wanted to bribe. Now, this is the same Paul that was able to go, because he told him what he had done, to travel all through these Gentile nations to raise money. He thought, well, if you can raise money for the needy in Jerusalem, surely you can raise money to get out of prison. Now, could Paul have raised some money and gotten out of prison? Sure he could have. Does that go against the principles of the New Testament? Absolutely, 100%. Paul was not going to do that. So Paul declined his generous offer to allow him to leave prison with a little money. Brother, man, my mind is so bad. Jim Waldron was telling me when he was in India, when he was still able to go, that they had a brother that was arrested over there by the government, and they were, in India, and I haven't been over there in years. It's hard to go now. A lot of people are still going, but they're really cracking down. But the government is corrupt, and they were trying to bribe the brethren. And Jim said, we're not going to pay. And they called it tea, wanting tea. And said, we want tea. And Jim said, Paul stayed in prison for 2 years. And they were just shocked. And they asked Jim, said, you want this man to be in prison for 2 years? He said, no, we don't want him in prison for 2 years, but we're not paying a bribe. We're not going to pay a bribe. And so eventually, I mean, he was in prison. He was in jail over there for a little while. Not Jim, this brother, this native brother, but he eventually was allowed to leave. At any rate, Paul was kept in custody, and Felix was replaced by Festus. And Festus, like Felix, wanted to pander to the Jews, and so he also allowed Paul to remain in custody. And so at this point, Luke takes the reader up to about 60 A.D., and that takes us up to chapter 25. Chapter 25 doesn't take long to cover, but what we do have in chapter 25, let's read the first 5 verses of it, kind of give us a standing of where we are. Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. So the new governor there in Palestine, again, he allowed Paul to stay in his bonds. And so after about 3 days, he decided to go to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Now there was a reason for that. Jerusalem was the largest city in the province. It also was where the largest population of the Jews were, and that was his constituency. So he needed to go pander to them. He needed to go down there and try to make friendly with them. So he did. And so, of course, once he got there, they began to tell him about Paul. Now, let's keep in mind that it's been 2 years. Their hatred has not died down at all against Paul. They still want this man dead. And so they act like, well, let's bring him down to Jerusalem. Likely they're telling him, hey, we want him to stand trial down here. So on the way, well, we're going to kill him. Now, there's no reason for us to think that Festus knew anything about this plot, but there's every reason to know that Paul would have thought, well, hey, they just want to kill me. Because that had already happened once before, right? That's why he was in Caesarea, because of such as that. Well, Festus declined the offer. He said, Paul's going to stay in Caesarea. Now, if you want to come and accuse him up there, come on. Who all of you can, come on up, and then you accuse him, and we'll see what happens. Well, 6 through 12, we see that after having spent about 10 days in Jerusalem, Festus returns to Caesarea, and the very next day after he gets there, he convenes court. So that's very quick. He doesn't waste any time. Now again, remember, he's trying to gain favor with the Jews. That's what he wants. Because if the Caesar sends you somewhere to be governor and you can't handle it, and there's just uproar after uproar after uproar, you're out of here. If he doesn't kill you, he's going to put you somewhere and it's so bad, you kill yourself. And that's what happened to a lot of them. The tradition says that's what happened to Pilate. And so, because with the Roman Empire, they let you carry on as normal, but they didn't want you causing problems. You could maintain a form of your own government. You could kind of do what you wanted to do, just don't cause a problem. And if the governor couldn't maintain that, Caesar didn't like that. And so we see Festus trying to curry favor with them. So we have the Jews, they're present there, they're standing around, and when Paul's brought before the court, they level these many grievous charges. Now, Luke doesn't tell us what they are, but he does indicate they couldn't prove them. Now, judging by Paul's reply in the following verses, it seems like they're probably the exact same charges Tertullus laid out against him. Paul denied them. Now, We're seeing the weakness in Festus. They didn't really put forth any good leaders. The Romans didn't. They're all weaklings. And so Festus goes to Paul and he says, hey, you don't mind going down to Jerusalem, do you? And standing before those men down there? You know, he's kind of wanting to get on the good side. And Paul reminds him. He says, look, I'm in a Roman court, which is my right, and you know this. So I think that's where I'll stay. I haven't done anything to break the laws of the Jews. And so he knew that if he went to Jerusalem, they would find a way to kill him. And he wasn't going to do that. And so Paul courageously affirmed that he had done no crime punishable to be executed. Now here's an important little bit of information here that sometimes we overlook. I think it's important when we're looking at the idea of a capital punishment. And we add this to Romans 13, 1 through 7. Paul talks about in Romans how the state doesn't wield the sword in vain. Well, the purpose of a sword is to kill. The state has the authority within it to kill citizens worthy of death, that have been judged worthy to be killed. We call that capital punishment. Okay? Now, whatever side a person personally falls on that, there are certain crimes that the state has affirmed. If you kill somebody, you murder somebody, rather, let me put it that way. If you murder someone, you stand having the opportunity or in danger of being put to death. Okay? That's God's law too, by the way, isn't it? And so, and I personally agree with that. If you murder someone, okay, that's the penalty. Now, Paul here, without stating that straightly, he acknowledges, if I have done anything worthy of death, or if I have broken a law where the penalty is death, I accept that. And so this is just like some of these other statements we've talked about. This is another supporting fact where Paul recognizes the state has the right to put to death criminals who break laws that require the person to be put to death. And so he says, hey, if I have broken a law where the penalty is death, I will not fight it. I recognize that the state has that right. And he wrote that in his letter to the Romans. So finally, what he does here, since he sees how this thing is turning, he says, well, I make my appeal to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he had every right to do that. He could make his appeal to Caesar. And by doing that, and we see that Paul's citizenship in this instance saved his life, because if they had decided to ship him back to Jerusalem, he would have been in big trouble. But also by making his appeal to Caesar, he fulfilled the promise that Jesus made to him in 23 verse 11, where he would go to Rome. You've bore my name in Jerusalem, and you will also do it in Rome. Now, the emperor at that time was Nero, who was an absolute bottom of the barrel kind of individual. He was a homosexual. He openly practiced homosexuality. By the time he was 25, he had murdered his wife, his adopted brother, and his mother. And so he was someone not to have anything to do with at all. So Paul comes before Agrippa, and we'll have to quickly mention this and end. After another unspecified period of time, Agrippa and his sister Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus and Drusilla. Again, Agrippa, Bernice, and Drusilla were all siblings. Now, Agrippa was king. The lineage or the line of the Herods, they were all, I don't know if there ever was a good one out of the bunch, but Agrippa had sided with the Romans during the war between 66 and 70, and he lived about until 100 AD, history tells us. But anyway, Festus told Agrippa about Paul's case, explained to him the things that had happened, and he wanted to know a little more about the situation because Agrippa was a Jew. And so he was asking him some things, and he told him about the Jews in Jerusalem wanting Festus to make a decision. Well, what they wanted to do was say, hey, put Paul to death. And he told him, said, well, Roman law doesn't allow for that. A man can't be put to death unless he's been found guilty, and he has a right to stand before his accusers. See, our law says that. And that comes from that law. We have adopted that from this law. And so as Luke had already reported, on the following day, Festus convened his court to hear Paul's case. The Jews stood up. They brought these charges. And that brings us up to this point where he had appealed to Festus. Now, in verse 21, if you'll notice, this refers to Caesar Augustus. That is not the Caesar Augustus that we read about in the gospel accounts. That man reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD. Okay? In fact, that Augustus was the one who was reigning when Christ was born. But this Augustus was Gaius Caesar Octavianus. However you pronounce that. I messed that up. I had to pronounce that at least 8 times. But anyway, he was given that title by the Roman Senate, and other kings had worn that title also when they took the throne. But upon hearing about Paul, Agrippa's interest was piqued, and he said, so I'll hear the case. Now, we know it was out of interest and curiosity because he couldn't give a final decision. He couldn't give a verdict because why? Paul being a Roman citizen, he said, I appeal to Caesar. Didn't matter what Agrippa thought. Agrippa was King Herod Agrippa. And so Paul's situation here had developed in such a way that the Lord's promise was fulfilled. Paul would bear Christ's name before kings. Acts 9:15. So he's going to stand before King Agrippa, and he will also stand before the King of Rome. Now, again, he's not going to have the freedom of movement that he had previously enjoyed, but he's still going to influence a lot of people. When we read in Philippians 4:22, we're going to learn that some, even in Caesar's own house, had obeyed the gospel. And that's all because of Paul. But Festus began his introductory statement by addressing Agrippa and other important individuals present as they brought all this assembly together for Agrippa to hear about Paul. And you have all these chief soldiers come forth, and the chief captains, they were, I thought this was interesting. Chief captain was a commander over 1,000 soldiers. That's a large group. And you had several of these in this assembly, because you had a lot of folks in this assembly. So they brought Paul out, and Agrippa pointed out that Paul was the one, or the reason why we have assembled here today. So you have all of these political figures, and you have little old Paul there. He was the reason. And they're not getting it, that Paul is a greater man than all of those people combined. And if they would but listen to him, he could impact their life greatly. And so the reason that they came together for this was simply because in order to send Paul to Rome, there had to be a reason. They couldn't just send Paul as he appealed to Caesar, because that would be foolish. They had to have a written reason why this man had appealed. And so in their minds, and he stated this, maybe as we examine him in front of all these people, we can come up with a legitimate reason why he's been charged. And then we'll send him on to Nero, and we can write down the reason for that. So he's been through all of these examinations, and no one has yet to come up with a legitimate reason why he's been charged with anything. So that is what all this pomp and circumstance is about. while King Agrippa is there, while the governor of Palestine is there, the second one now up to this point, and all these military figures, so they can try to manufacture a legitimate reason and charge against Paul on why they're sending him to Rome. Isn't that ridiculous? But that's why they're doing it. Any comments? All right. We'll pick up next time. 3 chapters to go. Thank you so much. What's that?